Good afternoon. Welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series, Fall 2020. Coming to you from Huxley College of the Environment in Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. My name is Stefan Freeland, and today is my pleasure to introduce Michael Medler. Michael is a faculty member here at Huxley College. He has an interest in fire and things, the interaction of fire and humans out there. He's the past president of the Association of Fire Ecology and was the founding editor of the journal Fire Ecology. Prior to some of his academic work, he was worked on firefighting, wildland fire crews. So he comes by his interest in fire honestly and with a personal history. His research beyond pyrogeography is spatial technologies and the intersection of that kind of study with science as well as policy. He's going to be bringing us a presentation today on pyrogeography and the 2020 fire season, which is still, I guess, a little underway. Please join me in welcoming Michael Medler.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm going to get started here in a second with, I pre-recorded this because I needed to do a little editing and I may get interrupted here at any time, but here, bear with me and I'll be right here with you the whole time and taking some questions. Let's see if I can make this all work. So, boom, boom. Share that. Hit go. Video. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the recording of the Huxley Speaker Series. I'm coming to you recorded live from Studio Solitude here. So yeah, welcome. It's a rainy November, and I wanted to chat a little about a couple things. Mostly this last fire season, but I'm really not going to talk that much about that. I'm going to try to put it in context into a much larger situation, basically. What's going on with wildland fire in the western United States. So let's get started. You've probably seen some news over the last couple months. It's been that kind of season. Apocalypse fires, apocalypse, the word apocalyptic, and apocalypse and fires all over the place. And it's been a crazy fire season. And it's been a big news fire season. And here a newspaper wanted to give us one chart to think about it. Here, and this is the West, California, Oregon, Washington. And yes, we've had big fires, more fires, trends going up. Here you got Washington, though we had bigger fires, and there's been years that have been bigger just a couple years ago. So, maybe it's not the biggest apocalyptic scene we've seen. I've been mucking around with data here this week trying to get up to date, but I'm not going to make you read a gazillion numbers in this talk, but I'm going to show a lot and tell you what I'm looking at. And so, for example, here, the National Interagency Fire and Sea Center, I went there and got the latest November data. And here, this is the last 10 years. And we used to have a lot, even back then, some 3 million acre summers. And this summer, we're closing in on 8.6. So I'll give you the big numbers. Over the last 10 years, we've averaged about 6.5 million acres of wildland fire each summer. This summer, so far, it's not over in California, we've burned about 8.6 million acres. Now, acre, hectare, square kilometer, numbers of cubits, it's all kind of ethereal. I thought this graphic was kind of helpful just for California. Here we have California's fires in the last 10 years, the 10 years before that, and the entire city of San Francisco. And humans are bad with scale and sizes, but yeah, San Francisco's 30,000 acres or so. And if you've ever tried to walk all the way across it, that's a big place. And the first 10 years of this century, these were the biggest fires that California had. This is the biggest fires in the last 10 years. And as of this article, it's interesting to note that these 5 were all still actively burning. So that gives you a sense of sort of, something not just like the 10 years before when we have this much. These are all bigger than anything in those 10 years. So California is seeing something different. And they're seeing different temperatures. And there's much been made of this, and we could have a long chat about all sorts of stuff associated with climate change and the changes in fire season. But the short of it is, all over the West, we're seeing longer fire seasons. They're starting earlier, ending later. We're seeing higher average temperatures. There's a few little pockets of exception in the Southwest, but we've seen more fire, more acreage, more numbers over the last decades, over the last years, and I want to sort of talk about that. We've also seen, as anyone lived around here, more smoke. We've had a couple years now. A couple years ago, I had climate refugees staying in my living room, living on my floor. There were people from the Bay Area, and they were fleeing with their children to come breathe our clean air. This last summer, folks up here in Bellingham got a taste of that yet again. And so wildland fires are changing. We're seeing more smoke. And here's a scene from Oregon. Oregon experienced some things that they hadn't really been experiencing all that much. And tremendous maps like I hadn't seen before. I fought fire in the 80s in the Willamette National Forest. And in those years, the largest fire I ever fought would have been about the size of some of these tiny little red dots. And those were as big as they got. And now all of a sudden in a single season, Oregon's got all of these big fires going on. Now, one thing that's fascinating, here's one of those bigger fires down from Ashland, Oregon. The pink is the areas that burned. The green are the forests. So these aren't really forest fires, and I wouldn't even call this wildland. This is burning down the I-5 corridor. There's some great helicopter scenes of this, but basically this fire is following the I-5 corridor, burning down one neighborhood and skipping the next, burning one neighborhood and leaving houses. And when you look closely, a lot of the houses and buildings are burned with their hedges and trees all around them still green. This isn't a wildland fire. This isn't a forest fire. So we've kind of got to use some new names for these things. This was essentially an urban firestorm moving down the I-5 corridor. Imagine burning from Burlington, up to maybe up to the Alger Alps, that kind of scale. Now, speaking of scale, these fires in Oregon this last year are without much precedent on the west side of the Cascades, burning through essentially old growth forests that have mostly been logged. Most of these fires are burning through second growth, but still the scale of these is a little beyond anything people in Oregon, firefighters that have been there for 30 years, have never seen anything like these. And in order to give a Washington crowd a little bit of sense of this is eastern Oregon. This is the Willamette Valley. This is Bend, Sisters, Smith Rocks, these areas over here. I had a friend working on the Lion's Head fire for weeks on the east side of the Cascade Crest. They spent weeks pushing it up onto Mount Jefferson, thinking they could put it out in the glacier. Snows up there. Winds, huge east winds came up on a super hot, dry day, and boom, the fires connected and ran almost to Salem. Same thing happened down here. The actual district I used to work on burned up almost entirely, and 20, 30 miles of fire, some of that burning in a single night, taking out several towns. Really dramatic stuff. Now, I just wanted to give sort of some scale. Here's that fire burning from the east side of the Cascades all the way over to nearly Salem, Oregon. 56.6 miles. That's a lot of single fire. A lot of this happened in a single night into the next day. Just to give you some scale, if you can see any of this, here's a line that long drawn in Washington. That's like a fire starting in Leavenworth and making it to Issaquah in a day. If you've ever driven over the Cascades, that should give you a sense of what we're talking about in Oregon. Colorado, wow, just wacky stuff all summer. I have many friends and family that live in Colorado, and these were the kinds of weather maps they would see. Fire, snow, snow, fire, hot, cold, and all this stuff was coming and going. The Front Range, Boulder, Fort Collins, that area has had several fires burning all summer that are by far the largest they've seen in that region, and particularly those forest types in recorded history. Some of the stuff that made it different was even this year, like California, their fire season went up till just a couple days ago. Some of these largest fires actually were running into Estes Park. The city of Estes Park up above Boulder was evacuated. People in Boulder were starting to get serious about putting their photos into metal boxes and things like that. This last fire of the season, of several very large ones, actually was running into the night. People were evacuating, and by the next morning, this was my brother's yard in Boulder. So we're slamming our things right together. This was, in fact, the wind from the cold front coming in gave these fires some tremendous pushes. So rather than talk too much about this year's fire season, I want to say a few things. It seems impressive. There's been some really large fires in areas that haven't had large fires in a long time. But some of those are places like Western Washington and Oregon where fires are pretty rare, but when they do burn, they're large. So I want to set some more of the context. So, yes, climate is changing. Things are getting hotter earlier in the season. Things are staying hot later. More importantly, maybe we have longer, drier times, less precipitation, but more importantly, less moisture in the air. So we've seen larger fires, more fires, though the numbers not as big a changes as the acreages, and we're seeing a lot more money spent on fire. And this is because of the changes in climate, a century of fire policies that we'll talk about, and rapid development. So, forests. We're all pretty familiar with this idea that stopping fire makes fires burst. So yeah, there's this popular notion that I don't think I have to explain to very many people that many forests used to be structured such that fire occurred often and would burn the understory. Fire would come through, burn the stuff that's growing down here, and leave the big trees. And this story is true in a lot of drier areas east of Washington, eastern Oregon, big chunks of places like Nevada, New Mexico, and Colorado, and even Wyoming. But it's not true everywhere. Here in the West, we have a kind of more complicated system of fires happening every 100, 200, 500 years. But in these big acreages, these millions and millions of acres throughout the West, if you stop fires, then other stuff grows underneath. And so in 20, 30, 40 years, you start seeing a whole nother set of things that we call ladder fuels. And then when a fire does occur, less often, it has these fuels to burn hotter and get up into the canopies of the trees and kill big patches. And that's another change we're seeing, is much bigger patches of complete canopy mortality, every tree being killed. We have lots of photo series, lots of evidence of how Washington, Oregon, Idaho used to look 100, 120, 30 years ago, and it was really different. The landscapes in these drier areas really had complicated mosaics where lots and lots of fires had burned in lots of different patches at different times. And now we see big landscapes covered with trees more or less the same ages, and perhaps bug kill and other interesting things going on that we could talk about at length. But I'm not here to really get into that today. What I'm talking about today is this idea that the forests in the West now are choked with underbrush or dead fuel on the floor of the forest, and that changes the way fires are burning. But this brings up this other really big question that I've had students work on a couple different times over a bunch of different years, and that question is, how much fire would we expect if we weren't doing all the suppressing, if we weren't sending in fire crews, if we weren't coming in with airplanes and trying to stop things, if we weren't doing all this, how many acres a year would the western United States be experiencing fire on? And a while ago, we started having the kind of data that would let us answer these questions. A bunch of friends of mine got involved in this big project, and we were able to get students involved in it over the years to actually go out and stand on the ground. And they put together this amazing data set, literally 30-meter pixels, 100-foot by 100-foot pixels for the entire United States, and almost 30 different data layers, slope, elevation, aspect, but also a bunch of vegetation data, what kinds of plants are growing there, how much bulk density, and in our case, a bunch of information about fire regimes. And fire regimes are just this idea that a given place has a way that fire behaves in that area. Here in this, you see fires that areas that don't burn very often, places that burn really often, places don't very hot. Once again, this is all the context of, say, our pyrogeography class. We could learn a lot more about that in that class. The data set I'm interested in here is mean fire return interval, which is to say, for every pixel, every place in Washington or Georgia or Oregon, how often, on average, do you expect a fire to get to that spot? And if you look up here in Washington, we got all this green stuff up here, which is this 200, 300, even 500 to 1,000 year range, which means these areas we don't expect fire very often. Over here on the east side, we've got areas with 50s and 70s and lots even in the 20s and 30s here. So now 30s into the 20s. And maybe a little bit up here, this fire area that burns very often. Other states like Georgia are almost completely full of places that traditionally, without suppression, without human management, would burn every 4, 5, 6, 10 years. So this is a really powerful data set, and it lets us do some basic math. So here, follow me. I'll use the idea of hectares instead of acres. They're about 2 acres. But let's say we have some plots out in the ground, and one of them has a 1 year, one has a 2 year, and another has a 5-year fire return interval. And what that means is in this first one, the one we expect fire to get there about once a year. We can do some quick math here and figure out that, well, then on average, every year, that plot would probably burn up. The one that burns every 2 years, on average over time, half, and the one that burns over 5 years, only 2 of those hectares. So at any given year, on average, which is a big set of assumptions. Average doesn't really tell us the ranges and the distributions, but over the long haul, we would expect about 17 hectares of these 30 hectares to burn each year. And if we had areas in Washington with those kinds of numbers, we can do that math. Now remember, in Washington, we've got lots of longer fire return intervals, 200s and 300s, and that has a big effect. Rather than 17 hectares, if we had areas with 10, 50, and 250 year average fire return intervals, that means on average, calculated across a long span of time, we would actually expect a much smaller, only like 1 1/4 hectares area to burn. Now, what this means is we have a basic tool now. We can go look at the data for Washington, the Western United States, the entire United States, and figure out on average across the region how much fire we'd be expecting. So this is handy. We go in and we take all these pixels, we figure out how often they'd expect to burn, and then we take areas and we compare to the actual fire record. We've also fairly recently finally had good fire records. All of these big dots or triangles are fires over 1,000 acres. The little ones are smaller. You see the fires don't really occur as much in the urban areas and the Palouse and big areas. But we have now the data to ask the question, are all these fires representing what we would expect without suppression? And we can do it for the entire western United States. We have the same data for Alaska. We have it for the 11 western states. And so once again, I'm just going to wave my hands and throw up some numbers. You can focus on them if you want. I'm going to highlight the big take-home. I'm just showing you what we did with students here. We took those data sets and figured out, well, on average, how many hectares burn each year in these states. Here in Washington, on average, over this long time span that we were working with, we were getting about 58,000 hectares, so twice as many acres, a little more. And then we were able to calculate how much we would expect without suppression. And notice these numbers tend to be bigger, in fact. And those ranges, remember, each pixel might have a range of 200 to 400 years or 10 to 20. So we calculated both the low and the high possible numbers. And then we were able to calculate the fire deficits, the low and high fire deficits. Now what you might see here is, for example, in Washington, even though we're burning 58,000 hectares on average, we're falling behind 100,000 hectares. So what this means is each year, if we burn the average amount, we are not keeping up with the amount of fire that area would expect without suppression. Now, we've cut out all the farms, we've cut out all the cities, we've cut out all the rocks and glaciers and lakes. This is burnable surface. Now, what this means is that if an area has traditionally burned at a certain time frame, that's part of its fire regime. And if you change that, you change the ecosystem. You change which plants dominate, you change which animals can live there. So without getting into the goods and the bads of whatnot, the main fact here is that with our current system of fire suppression and the way we're working with fire in Washington and all of these states, except maybe Alaska, we're seeing a huge fire deficit in which we're changing these ecosystems, and most importantly, making most of them more explosive, leaving more fuel on the ground. This means we're not finishing that stuff off in fires and it's staying around. Now here's, like I said, I'll give you some big round numbers. So by these calculations, it takes 17 to 24 million acres a year to sustain the systems. We're only burning on average about 4.4. The numbers come up a little in the last couple of years, but that's still about right. So it means we're falling behind 13 to 20 million acres a year, each year in the western United States. So that means each year there's that much more place that has built up fuels, built up stuff that might burn hotter, might change the forest, and might burn bigger patches and might get into our cities. And so this is why this is such a big deal. This is the stuff we're worried about moving into fire seasons and trying to think as a country and as a set of social responses. What are we going to do about this? Now, I can also run the same numbers for the entire conterminous United States, and you get some interesting things there too. Once again, for the entire United States, it takes a lot of fire, 69 to 200 something million acres, to keep these ecosystems from changing. And this is, once again, cutting out cities and farmlands and stuff like that. On average, we're burning almost 6. And so we're falling behind 60 million. I'll go with the low number here, just to round off. Now, those numbers are crazy numbers. If you go look at the history, and I've been doing this research for a while, so here's the last half of the 20th century. Once again, don't need to look at the numbers too much if you're just listening, but that 4 million acre average from the 60s, 4, 3, 4, a big fire season was 7, 4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 1. Up and then maybe into the 80s, you start seeing a little bit bigger numbers, more 5s and 6s, but that's still 4, 5, 6, 8 million acres a year. So when I first was doing this research, people would often tell me, Medler, you've missed carrying the 0 or something. Your numbers are not reasonable. That can't be right. But we've finally been able to go back and reassemble a lot of better old data sets. And one thing you see as you go back in decades, here's the last 10 years before that, you start seeing, 6, 6, 3, 2, 3, 4, in the 1950s, 8 million. In the 40s, 22, there's that number, 20 million. In the 30s, 39 million. So before we were suppressing, before we had extensive fire suppression, we were seeing the kind of numbers that this ecosystem model suggests would be what you'd expect without suppression. Now, there's a bunch of caveats in here. For example, back here in the 20s and 30s, we're burning very large, massive, many, many mile clear cuts that have been left with slash. They burn hot. But still, generally what you're seeing is a system in which these fires are occurring at these kind of rates. Now, just to visualize it a little, here's the last 20 years. Going back, we had a very long, dry spell without much fires. Some would say it sort of turned around with the big Yellowstone fires in '88, and you see this quick inflection point in the 50s to these really big numbers. And I've looked in a bunch of different data sets and different ways it's been recorded, and you see this same phenomenon, this low lull, and then these huge numbers, and then before the 30s, really not much data. I don't think this means there's not fires. This just means they weren't getting written down in the same way. It's interesting to look at the 50s. Just in the 50s, from 1950 to 1959, this is when this transition occurred. Had 20, 30 million acres. All of a sudden, we're down to 15, and boom, we're down to what we saw for the next 40 years, 3s and 4s. Remember, the 50s, it's after World War II, in some cases after parts of the Korean conflict, and what we have are lots of folks trained in a military approach, and we have lots of equipment. And we have this idea of a unit, a fighting unit, that comes into the fire service of various different states, and into the Forest Service and the Park Service, and they start developing fire crews, 20-person crews with lots of tools and access to helicopters and airplanes, and boom, you see this successful fire suppression effort when we kick in the tools. Now, I've just recently been having students readdress this. There's lots of questions about this particular analysis. Are the states the right unit, for example? Are we doing this right? So I've gone back and have students do this again recently. I'm hoping to get this done into another grad student project here this year. And in essence, what we see are, the same sorts of results. We've done it again, this time using ecoregions, which have similar trees and systems rather than the sort of arbitrary state boundaries. And you see in all but this little corner of the Southwest, we're seeing big fire departures in average mean interval returns. What does that mean? It means the same thing. We're falling behind 35 million acres, maybe a lot more, each year in the United States. So and that's hectares there. So these are big numbers. These are, once again, these staggeringly big numbers. Well, so what? What does all that really mean? What do we get out of this? Well, remember, we're burning bigger and bigger areas. We're spending more and more money. We're fighting way more fires. Here's something that I think is a way to think about this. A couple years ago, the head of the Forest Service got in front of the U.S. Senate at a committee meeting and provided this number, that over 40 million acres are in need of treatment in the United States. 400 million acres. And what that means is there are 400 million acres that the Forest Service estimates have missed fires enough that the fuels have grown up, and they're now expecting untraditional fire behavior, which is those apocalyptic fires of the news, which are the big runs, which are the burning into communities from outside. This is a huge number, 400 million acres. It's about the size of Alaska. I have spent weeks with chainsaws, working in groups of 10, trying to clear a single acre. At 1 acre. Days, not even days, probably weeks. This is not a number you can really get your heads around. Like, how many million people would it take to hire and have work over how long to thin an area this big, to get in front of it? And remember, we're falling behind 20, 30, 40 million acres each year as it stands. Now, another big idea is the wildland-urban interface. This idea of these places where humans and wildlands collide, and where wildland fires will tend to move right into these communities. And there's a lot of different estimates. We've had some good grad projects here at Western where people have actually mapped them out. And depending, if I round up, you can argue there's about 200 million acres of WUI in the United States. And not all that's in the West. There's quite a bit in the East Coast. So this has left us with this crisis. Here in California, we've been having problems with the power company. They've had such huge liability issues for fires that they may have been contributing to the beginning of that took through the town of Paradise a couple years ago. That they've had to turn off power and fires are coming. We have a large political arena now that is blaming each other on who isn't doing enough raking and leaving the forest with stuff to burn. But yeah, so let's talk about that. this is this model that some people think, okay, if you have a forest and you were to clear out the underbrush and then you have the rest for harvest, for merchantable timber, this is a kind of area where you might be able to get in with hand crews or tools. And there might be other areas where you can get in with bigger equipment and thin up the logs and pile them up and burn them in the off season. But once again, this is extremely labor intensive. This is sort of like the work I've done. And to do an acre of this is not a small task. And to do 100 acres of this requires many people, many weeks. And to do 1 million acres of this is pretty outside the realm of any agency's activity. And to do 400 million is crazy. And then there's this. Great areas of places like the state of Washington are not flat tree farms with nice little rows and easy roads. They're rough, crazy terrain with no roads nearby. This is not going to get thinned by people with chainsaws. And we could talk about logging and its effect, but the short answer is no. Logging takes out 40, 50 acres if you're the Forest Service. It changes the way fires behave, but you actually take out the part that's going to burn the least, the big boles of the tree, and you leave the brushy stuff. So clear cutting and the kinds of way we do industrial forestry does not take off the materials that are likely to lead to bigger fires. So the only way we're going to get anywhere near even an order of magnitude or two of dealing with 400 million acres or 40 million or 4 million is to use fire to do the thing fire has traditionally done. The best way we can replace fire is odd enough with fire. Go figure. I can start a match, we can set it on the ground, and we might be able to burn off 1 million acres at a time. It's a massively more efficient way than to try to build roads and use chainsaws and machines. But let's do a couple other quick numbers here. So of those 4 million acres, the Forest Service is currently treating about 2 million acres a year. And of that, only about 250,000 acres is treated by people doing stuff. That's still mostly the Forest Service not even using prescribed fire, but allowing wildland fires to burn on purpose when they're burning in areas where they want them to burn to do some thinning. So once again, we have 400 million acres. We're falling behind 20, 30, 40 million acres a year. We're currently working on 2 million acres a year. And that's, once again, some prescribed fire where you go in and light in the off season and it clears out some of the underbrush. And that has a whole host of issues. It may not actually mimic the natural fire regimes very well. And one interesting example, once again, a student here at Western worked on a project where we looked at how off-season fires have different effects on the plants. In the heat of the summer, a big fire might roll through, say, eastern Washington and leave a lot of the big trees and the roots in the ground intact. If you go in and do a prescribed fire in the off-season, in the spring or the fall, those soils are much wetter. And it's just like grabbing a pan with a wet pot holder. When you hit that wet pot holder on the pan, you make steam and you burn your hand. A dry pot holder lets you grab that. In the same way, a very hot fire can go across dry ground and roots an inch or two down are fine. You do a fire in the early spring when the ground's soaking wet and have even a much lower intensity fire on the ground, the radiant heat goes in and kills the roots of plants that would have survived a much hotter summer fire. So there's complications here. So the take home of all this is we can't cut our way out of this. We're not going to head out there and hire 1 million people and get them working with chainsaws and get them thinning, though that has some interesting appeals to it in our current situation with high unemployment. And I would argue we might be wanting to think a lot harder about hiring 100 or 200,000 people to get on this project. We also can't afford to keep doing it the way we've been doing it. We fly DC-10s and 747s. We put thousands of people on fires that are way back in the wilderness that have no chance of getting towards anyone. We spend a huge amount of money protecting stuff that isn't worth nearly as much as we're spending to protect it. We have a kind of odd war mentality that we're fighting fire with. And we have lots of unintended consequences. Here's a fire near Twisp where an air tanker flew over a creek, which they're supposed to be very careful not to do, and the retardant ended up in the water. I have found streams like this in fires when I was on fire crew without any, you couldn't even see the red in them, but every single fish was dead. We found creeks in Yellowstone in '88, for example, with hundreds and hundreds of trout just floating dead downstream from a very small bit of retardant hitting the stream upstream. So this, even the act of fighting fire is not without complications. So what I'm sort of here to say is the net of all this is we need to reintroduce millions of acres of fire every year. And this is, I don't say this lightly. As someone who's been living with the smoke, yeah, that's an issue. And we need to figure out how to treat these areas with the same system that they have co-evolved with. These forests have spent tens of thousands, in some cases millions of years, evolving with a fire regime that changes a little. There's changes in climates and stuff like that. But fire has been a part of these forests, just like rain is part of the forests here, or just like tides are part of the ecosystems when tides move in and out. We just have a hard time with something that visits every 50 or 100 years in places, and it's very hard to plan for. And there's a lot of other rubs, including the fact that an awful lot of people have now built into these areas. And not just built small, but often big in houses, and often representing powerful people who have moneyed interests who don't want to see their personal forests burned down. So there's lots of complicated social issues. Fires are also a thing that brings out a huge amount of social inequity issues. The people in California breathing the most smoke might be the people that still have to work in the farm fields near them. The communities most affected might be the ones that don't have insurance as much, or are living in trailer homes that are not going to be insured, and suddenly they're homeless. So there's all sorts of social elements, which I'm proud to say the Pyrogeography class right now is really grappling with a bunch of those. But let's back up. So where do we stand? 400 million acres, nice round number. 200 million acres of people living, which some of that's mixed, some of it's not. And we're only treating about 2 million acres a year with fire, so we're falling behind 10 times as fast as we're doing anything about it. And here's this. When fires get into these communities, it's not a wall of fire and the trees raging through. This is a very typical scene. I was hoping to show a video, I don't think I have time, from Ashland, but this is what you see over and over and over, is a whole community, in some cases 20 times this many houses. The city of Paradise, for example, thousands of houses. Often with the hedges still around the houses and forests nestled up them. And sometimes this doesn't show it, but a house skipped here and there. And what you're seeing there is that this phenomenon is fire going from house to house, from embers from one burning house, landing on the roof of the next house, rolling down, getting in the rain gutters, catching dry leaves there, burning along the rain gutters till they hit a soffit, catching the soffit. And this happens slowly. In fact, maybe 2 houses are on fire, then 2 more, 20 minutes later, then 2 more. It's not a raging firestorm that just comes through and takes this community, but we aren't prepared for this. We have urban firefighting, which is well prepared to fight a house fire. But if you have 2 or 3, all of a sudden a neighborhood like this, for example, doesn't have enough water pressure to fight 3 house fires at once. And if you have 10 or 1,000 houses burning, we're completely ill prepared. So there are a lot of things we could talk about. Finally, we're starting to see a lot more fire resilient planning ideas. You could study this in our Pyrogeography class again. Look at, are there ways to make a difference here? And here's sort of the big take-home pictures is our current way we develop in these forested areas is you put in a road, you clear the areas around there, you put in some platforms, you get wires and you get water and sewer in there, and you start building houses. And you create in some ways kind of a worst case scenario with all these houses backed right into the woods. An alternative might be to think of that community initially as an entity, not think of it as individuals, the rugged individuals out each having their own home nestled in the woods, but think of it as a unit that can have clearing around it and a road that goes all the way around, so now fire trucks and crews can move. There's thinning here. This is the kind of place where you could get in, where the kind of work I was doing made sense. Cut some trees, do some thinning, create a buffer, and then within there have houses that you can easily get in and out of with escape routes that you don't get caught up one-way streets. And there's lots of information now on how to do this at your own home level too. So there's a city level and community level and home level. At the home level, you can clear pretty much the vegetation around the first 5 feet of your house and make that less flammable, and you've really dropped the odds of your house catching on fire. Clean up your roof gutters and things like that, and you've really changed your odds. Now, I wanted to talk quickly about an experiment, natural experiment that occurred in Colorado about 8 years ago. 2 fires were burning essentially in the same weather conditions in extremely similar topography in 2 different towns. One was the Waldo Fire in Colorado Springs, and it burned up maybe billions of dollars of houses and ran right down into town and caused tremendous damage. Here's a map of it coming down, taking these whole communities out and coming down into the city. And it was, at the time, one of the most expensive fires. I think it might have been the most expensive fire in Colorado history. Simultaneously, a fire, identical conditions, identical winds, pushing over a similar ridge, was burning in Boulder, Colorado, the 4 Mile Canyon, and it burned down into the same sort of front. Here you can see it coming over the ridge and burning down in the exact same day and time as the same conditions blew the fire down the ridge in Colorado Springs. Now, very different results. At the time, it looked like, oh, same thing was going on in both places. But Boulder had this. Boulder had the open space park system. It had this huge greenway. And once again, I've worked there. I've worked there as a ranger. I'm pretty familiar with this area. It was never intended to be a fire break when it was developed. It was actually developed by setting up an old-fashioned financial way to preserve land. The city bought it. They did a sales tax of, I think, 0.7%, and that generated enough money to buy the farmlands around town up against the mountains. And they then maintained them as open farmlands. They kept grazing and they maintained these large buffers. And when these fires come into Boulder from above down these forests, this is more than enough area for fire crews and hoses to catch it and stop it from getting into town. Colorado Springs developed their town right up through the same ridges and actually across some of the same sorts of farm fields and got the houses in there. And when the fires came down the ridges, it went right into these areas. So what were some of the differences? Well, Boulder had maintained a very aggressive prescribed fire plan in order to keep those meadow spaces looking as meadows. They would actually go to house and people would be told, hey, I want to show you these pictures from what Boulder looked like 100 years ago in these large open spaces. We're trying to historically preserve this way the city used to look. And that was very successful for decades, and they managed to keep it open. And they've had all sorts of clever things. They even had a Christmas tree cutting event each year where you could go in and cut Christmas trees, and they would use tens of thousands of people to go out and do their thinning for them for free by just saying, hey, this is the 50 acres, you're welcome to get Christmas trees. In fact, it became so successful, so many thousands of people came to cut trees for free that they had to cancel it because of the impact on the local neighborhoods with parking. I always think of it as one of the tragedies. Successful program. So where I'm going with this is it's like our modern 21st century notion of flooding. We used to put everything down by rivers. We used to put everything down on the oceans and the zones that would flood with hurricanes. We've learned the hard way over hundreds and hundreds of years not to put the hospitals and the fire departments and the police departments down on the low flat land by the river that floods every 10, 20 years. We're much better off putting our playgrounds down there and things like that and having open space. So after the floodwaters recede, we can just simply go take the weeds off the swing sets instead of having to rebuild a hospital. This same notion now is how I'd argue we need to think about fire. So follow me through one last bit of GIS-y math here. But students took a set of maps of every place in the western United States that has a name. So this isn't just towns. This is Nugent's Corners and whatnot and Demings. These are post offices. And we took those areas and we put buffers around them. So we take all these areas and put about a quarter-mile buffer, like that thing we see in Boulder, a big enough area that you can really work it. And without even trying to figure out where those are of use. For example, Boulder, we put them all the way around the city, not just on the forest side here, but on the cornfield side. And we put them everywhere in the entire western United States. I'm just going to zoom through some math here. But the net result was there's only about 11, 12 million acres in those buffers for the western United States. So let's go through this again. 400 million acres needs treatment. People are living in spread around about half that much area size. The Forest Service is thinning about 2 million acres a year, but it only would take, let's call it 11.7. It would only take 12 million acres to buffer all these communities. And of that, I would only, a fifth, a tenth actually needs any treatment. So we're back down to same sorts of numbers. If we could treat the buffered areas, now that's a size we can get our heads around. 2-3 million acres of that buffer would represent most of the places communities are at risk. So we could, at the scale we're working now, the 2 million acres a year of thinning and prescribed fire, we could start focusing on that on communities. Here's Missoula, Montana, and make them have these buffers that have the ability to stop them from being susceptible to backcountry wildland fires. Now, this also means we could use mechanical thinning there. That's where the chainsaws and roads make the most sense. When you do this sorts of thinning, you take off all the material, you can do it in this area, and that's where we have actual capacity to use it. If you harvest branches and pine needles 25 miles up a dirt road, it just doesn't pencil out to take it anywhere to turn it into anything. This fuel, but in an area that's an urban area where you'd be transporting at very small distances, roads are established, you could actually use these as fuels for things like aviation fuel. It's actually a good source. The dean here at Huxley has worked on projects actually looking at taking these kinds of timber resources and turning them into things like aviation fuels. Also, we could change from our 20th century firefighting as a war model to a different model. For example, I'm proposing that a lot of rural communities could benefit greatly by having a local crew, 5, 10, 20 folks, that would have an opportunity to work in the off season to actually maintain these fire breaks, to maintain these areas, to make sure these communities are resilient. This would do a couple things. One is one of the crises so often mentioned in rural America is that there's no jobs available for young people and people leave. This would provide a career option for people that want to stay, work through the year, and if fires do come to these areas, these folks are readily trained, know the area tremendously well, know where they have problems, know where they've got strong fire breaks, and would be a tremendous asset when a fire comes into any of these sorts of communities. We also need people whose whole shtick is working on fires in the backcountry. We need backcountry fire folks who aren't firefighters but know how to keep fire on the ground, move fire on the ground, keep it out of areas you're most concerned with. Maybe you don't want it in a riparian area, but you want it in this particular meadows. This is a whole career option. In fact, over the last decades, there's been coming and going. We now have wildland fire use modules in the Forest Service and Park Service over the last years, where well-trained firefighters get extra training and learn to manage a fire without attacking it and putting it out, but keeping it burning and being trained enough to be able to call in resources if it does get out of hand. So these are the kinds of things I'm proposing as a response to the situation we have now. So once again, 2020, totally wacky year by the sheer acreage. We've had bigger years. But what we're seeing are more fires burning larger, and we're seeing more threats to urban areas, especially in California and Oregon. We've seen just tremendous damage coming down into communities. And in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen huge problems with that. So we're going to have to rethink that. So all those numbers really add up to, wow, we've got a problem that's at a massive scale. And most solutions people refer to are at scales that round to zero. What will we do with 400 million acres? Well, a couple 40-acre clear cuts here and there aren't going to change that. We're going to have to change our entire approach to wildland fire, our thinking about it. And I would argue that if we can make our homes and our communities resilient enough that wildland fires aren't a tremendous threat, it opens up fire to play its same role it has for millennia in the backcountry. It will allow us to let a natural process unfold. But as long as we're worried, if we're in, say, the town of Flagstaff, that if a fire 12 miles from Flagstaff might come towards our house, we're going to want that fire put out. What we need to do, and this is a huge change, would be to somehow get to the point where our communities feel resilient enough about wildland fire and understand the timings and seasons of things like smoke that we can allow these systems to play out in the ways they always have, and then begin to target where that's not acceptable. Where do we really have to rethink that? And this is going to be a society-wide, century-long process of learning to live with fire. So I'm going to cut it off there, and I'll see if we can take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. And yes, those of you on Zoom are welcome to post questions to either the chat or the Q&A, and there are a few questions coming in. And one of them is big fires coming in. How do we know, is there a way of teasing out, I guess is the question, the big fires recently, is that as a result of fire suppression or climate change or both or neither? How do we know? How do you know?
Well, this is often one of those questions, just checking. I think you can hear me. And to a certain degree, it's like trying to figure out what happened with a single dice roll. What we do know is over a long period of time, climate change is changing a lot of this stuff. And to argue and get lost in the weeds on any individual fire, well, that was started by lightning and this was started by a campfire, sort of glosses over the big picture. I mean, we're talking about having 40, 50, 60, 70,000 fires in a given season. So ignition is kind of a given. There's going to be ignitions across the landscape. What happens once they get started is a whole nother thing. So yes, climate change is a huge variable. One of the subtleties with that is that prescribed fire puts you in a realm of having, as an agency, Park Service actually lit the matches and start things and put you in an entirely different liability situation. So one of the problems with prescribed fire is that, yes, when you do something like that, you have taken on a huge amount of liability, whereas if you simply were to not do it and let nature take its path or let lightning strikes or campfires go wild, then as a fire professional, you get celebrated for putting it out. And that's much more appealing. But yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about that. Other questions, Stefan?
Yeah. So here's one you'll like. What about the impact of climate change? Isn't this going to add a lot of CO2? I think this being letting fires go. Not only is it smoky in town, but what about the bigger impact?
Well, exactly. This is taking carbon on the ground and putting it in the air. And I hear myself out loud saying, wow, we need a lot more fire on the ground. And yes, that has serious implications for smoke and CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Once again, a very short, I don't mean to be flippant answer about this, is that's the system that has been going on for millions of years. The biomass above the surface of the earth has been cycling into the atmosphere and then back into trees and back into plants. And that's the established system that had been going until about 100 years ago. Climate change is really being driven by fossil fuels, by taking that system and saying, no, let's go get fuels that were cycled into the soils and then into the ground and turn into oil and coal, and let's get those back out. The thing about a fire is it burns off plants, trees that will grow back. And there's this sort of equilibrium. It keeps coming back. That same carbon will now be taken back in pretty quickly by plants growing. In fact, a study just came out today that reiterates some findings of some other studies a while ago that shows that really large trees, big trees, 3-4 foot diameter trees, are in fact the best store of carbon in forests. And by cutting large trees and focusing on the little ones, you're getting into a less efficient system. But when you have a large forest, fire comes through, you release all that smoke, so much of that carbon will be taken back in this ongoing ecological system. When we start thinking about it, one of the things that we're talking about here is that maybe we need to have serious talks about reforestation, taking millions and millions of acres that have been deforested and getting trees back in there. But in essence, I would argue wildland fire, as long as you don't immediately come in and pave over and stop that from being forests, is sort of a net wash. Now, we do have some problems in places where forests are having fires and the climate is changing enough that what grows back is not likely to be the same sort of forest. We have oak woodlands becoming grasslands, ponderosa pine forests possibly becoming oak woodlands. So there is a concern that these fires that are now not like our traditional fires will actually have climate impacts by changing the actual nature of the landscape. So there is that concern. But once again, the burning and the carbon is a cycle. Very different than the stuff we're bringing out of the ground and adding to the atmosphere would be my answer to that. But good question.
Yeah, fascinating. Who owns the land surrounding these rural communities? Obviously complicated, but in terms of that fire buffer, and what do you do in communities that are poorer than the city of Boulder in terms of purchasing that? Is that federal, state?
Actually, we've done a fair bit of work on that. And one of the problems has traditionally been that the federal government at several different times over the last decades has actually been fairly generous and said, here's a large pot of money, billions, to be used to do these kinds of thinning projects. But one of the big problems is those monies have often been designated specifically for federal lands. And you're absolutely right that most of these communities are not ringed by federal lands. The problem for a great many towns is not the Forest Service or Park Service land that the cities border. There are exceptions. There's a couple. I believe Flagstaff is famously surrounded by federal lands. And a lot of this isn't the Park Service. It's often the Forest Service, the BLM. But for example, here in Washington, you've got a way more complicated landscape ownership pattern, especially on the east side where we have tribal lands and county lands and a great deal of private lands, and it all mixed together with city lands and communities and private little inholdings, and the 1 mile checkerboard pattern of railroad ownership that's still in the landscape. So the short answer there is, in order to do this, it's going to take some money. Now, we are spending billions with a B each year now on wildland fire. And one of the problems with our current system is that we have federal money budgeted every year for these sorts of things. And then we have bigger fire seasons than we expect. And we borrow that money again another year. So we don't have the funds available. Now, this is something that has been congressionally being batted around for quite a while, for about a decade, trying to come to a solution to the fire borrowing problem. But in essence, I would argue the core of the problem is not budgeting in money for these sorts of projects that is not going to be borrowed as soon as there's a wildland fire again. That's been the history of that. Once again, I'm simplifying a great many things in all of these talks at a regional Western level. As a geographer, my pat answer for everything is it's complicated and it depends where you're talking about.
Right.
But that's a very good question. And I know that the state of Washington is financially strapped from a couple big fire seasons. And once again, they $150 million fire season a couple years ago that there was essentially no budget prepared for. And that money's not coming in the same ways it has traditionally from the federal government. So it's a wide open landscape.
Yeah, we're running out of time. There's a bunch of questions still to come in. I'm going to encourage people to contact you offline if they still have questions. But maybe you can quickly touch on, there's a number of questions relating to policy. And are there policies that either are supporting or hindering the kind of shifts you're suggesting at a state or a local level?
Well, there's a couple things. And the biggest problems are tending to be stuff that in the policy arena we tend to sort of call the NIMBY problems, not in my backyard. There's a lot of these things that people think make perfect sense until it's their valley burning up, until it's the hill behind their house or their house. And wildland fire is operating at a time scale, like I said, that we're not used to working and thinking around. One of the sort of cultural differences that's going to happen before some of this can play out is literally sort of an acceptance of it as a process. And I for one don't know that that's going to be easy or happen well. If a fire comes through your neighborhood and you lose access to your playgrounds, your mountain bike parks that are in the national forests and things like that, it may seem like they're gone. I would argue in most cases they're not gone. They'll be back. And in fact, often in 2 years, 3 years, it's amazing how pretty these areas can become. But because of smoke and because of the damage, no one's very supportive of these kinds of things in their neighborhood. And I would say that goes back to things like not having a resilient community. So if you want to look at big policy arenas that can make differences, I would be looking at building codes and insurance legislation and things like that that'll help these communities not feel like every fire in their neighborhood is a disaster. I know over in Winthrop, I met a hotel owner there who was quite emphatic about how I needed to look at the ridgeline behind her hotel and understand that what I was seeing was nature at its finest, and that the fires growing back there were beautiful and glorious, and I should enjoy that. And she had no idea who I was. She just wanted every tourist to know, this is cool. Check out the fires that are burning out here over the last 10 years. This is really pretty. And that really struck me as the kind of thing that's going to have to happen more. How? That's going to be a long conversation.
Okay, great. Yeah, to be continued, no doubt. Thank you, Michael. I want to mention that next week we have Angela Strucker from the Huxley's Institute of Watershed Studies, and she'll be talking on non-native fish species. So hope to see you all back there. Again, Michael, thank you. And
thanks everybody for coming by.
All right, we'll see you next week.
Okay, bye everybody.